Beijing and Manila clashing in the South China Sea after a Chinese Coast Guard ship reportedly expelled Philippine vessels from the contested Scarborough.
All right, moving on, the reckless act of Chinese warship chasing a smaller Philippine patrol boat has reignited tensions in the South China Sea.
Right, newly released footage shows a Chinese Coast Guard vessel crashing into one of its own warships.
In 1995, China made its first quiet move. On a lonely reef in the West Philippine Sea, it built small huts of steel. At that moment, the world did not care. But that step began a 30-year storm. And today, the Philippines is lost to Beijing forever. China tried everything. It gave big loans. It promised new trains and bigger trade. It used lasers, water cannons, and even stopped Philippine ships. But nothing worked. The people of Manila turned instead to America, Japan, and Australia. For Filipinos, this fight was never about a map. It was about fishermen losing their boats in the waves. It was about young soldiers holding ground on an old broken ship. It was about knowing who stands beside you when danger is near. So how did China lose a country it thought it controlled? And why is it now almost impossible to win back? The answer is unfolding right now. This is the untold story of how the Philippines broke free and why China may never recover from this defeat. It began in 1995. On a lonely patch of ocean called Mischief Reef, Chinese workers quietly built small huts of steel and wood. They called it a shelter for fishermen, but everyone knew what it really was: a beachhead in the West Philippine Sea. For the Philippines, it was a shock. The reef was not far, not disputed. It lay deep inside the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. It was the first real sign of Beijing's creeping expansion, and it set off the modern South China Sea crisis. Manila knew it could not match China ship for ship, but it could make one bold move. In 1999, a Philippine warship, the BRP Sierra Madre, was deliberately grounded on a shallow reef called Second Thomas Shoal. What looked like a wreck was actually a fortress in disguise. Dozens of young Filipino Marines were ordered to live on its rusting decks. No fresh water, no easy supply line, only the endless sea and the shadow of Chinese ships circling nearby. For the world, it was just a rusting ship, but for the Philippines, it became a frontline fortress. A symbol that said, "We will not leave." Both Mischief Reef and Second Thomas Shoal were inside the Philippine EEZ, recognized by international law. Yet one was now in Chinese hands. The other clung to life only through the courage of sailors on a ship that should have been retired long ago. The battle lines were drawn. Beijing's expansion on one side, Manila's desperate defense on the other. But as the new century began, a darker question haunted Manila. How long could it hold on alone? In 2012, the next flashpoint came. This time, it was at Scarborough Shoal, a triangle of rocks and reef rich with fish, lying well inside the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. It began as a routine patrol. Philippine vessels found Chinese fishermen taking giant clams. When the Navy tried to stop them, Chinese Coast Guard ships appeared, blocking the way. What started as a simple inspection turned into a tense standoff that lasted for weeks. Dozens of ships circled each other in the shallow waters. Fishermen were trapped. Nerves were breaking. Finally, a deal was offered, brokered by the United States. Both sides, they said, would withdraw. Trusting Washington, Manila pulled its ships back. But China never left. When the waters cleared, the Chinese flag remained at Scarborough Shoal. For the Philippines, it was more than a defeat. It felt like a betrayal. Ordinary Filipinos watched helplessly as their own reef slipped away. For the Navy, it was humiliation. For the people, it was heartbreak. They had believed in promises, yet those promises were broken. China gained a reef, but it lost something far greater: Manila's trust. From that moment, even leaders in the Philippines who once leaned toward Beijing began to doubt. Because every fisherman who lost his catch, every soldier who watched from afar knew the truth. Words could not protect them. Scarborough Shoal was gone, but it sparked a new question inside Manila's halls of power. If the Philippines could not match China at sea, and it could not rely fully on America's word, then how do you fight a giant without starting a war? In 2013, Manila made a move that shocked Beijing. It did not send warships or fire guns. Instead, it carried the fight to a courtroom in The Hague. The Philippines filed a bold case. Its target was China's sweeping 9-dash line, a claim that cut across almost the entire South China Sea. For decades, Beijing had drawn this line as if the waters belonged only to them. But now Manila was asking the world to judge. For 3 long years, the tribunal studied the case. Judges examined maps, reviewed fishing records, and read every treaty and law that shaped the sea. The evidence piled higher. The weight grew tense. On the 12th of July 2016, history was made. The verdict hit like thunder. The tribunal declared the 9-dash line illegal. It ruled that Mischief Reef lay inside the Philippine EEZ. It ruled that Scarborough Shoal had no legal basis for Chinese control. For Manila, it was a knockout victory. Across the country, people celebrated. Fishermen cheered. Soldiers stranded on the rusting Sierra Madre felt vindicated. For the first time in years, the law was on their side. But in Beijing, anger boiled. China rejected the ruling instantly. Officials called it nothing more than waste paper. Chinese ships stayed in the water. Construction on the reefs continued without pause. The ruling gave the Philippines a shield, but not a sword. It proved they were right under international law, but it did not force Beijing to stop. Still, the case changed everything. For the first time, a small nation had challenged a giant and won on the world stage. Yet the battle was far from over. If China could not silence Manila with force, and it could not erase the verdict with law, then it would turn to a new weapon. Not guns, not warships, but wealth and promises. After the courtroom victory, China changed its strategy. No more loud threats. This time it came with promises of gold. Billions of dollars were pledged for railways, bridges, and ports. The dream was grand. The Subic-Clark Railway to link bases and factories. The Mindanao Railway to open the south. New bridges to connect islands. New highways to bring trade. For a moment, hope filled the air. Ordinary Filipinos imagined faster trains, better jobs, easier lives. But as the years passed, the dream began to crack. Projects slowed. Deals collapsed. Some vanished without breaking ground. The Subic-Clark line was shelved. The Mindanao plan stalled. Billions promised, yet little delivered. Frustration spread across Manila. Was this help or was this bait? Was Beijing building or just buying time? Every delay deepened suspicion. Every broken promise weakened trust. By 2022, the pattern was clear. China's money was real, but its projects were not. For the Philippines, it was another kind of humiliation, not on the battlefield, but in the empty fields where railways were supposed to run. Dreams of prosperity turned into anger and doubt. Beijing had hoped money would heal the wounds of Mischief and Scarborough. Instead, the wounds only deepened because people remembered what had already been taken. Their reefs, their fishing grounds, their trust. Now, even the promise of wealth could not erase the bitterness. China had tested Manila's patience too long. And just as faith was fading, something else happened. Something that struck not in offices or boardrooms, but on the dark waters of the West Philippine Sea. A night that would harden Filipino hearts forever. In 2019, the sea turned cruel. On the dark waters of the Reed Bank, a Filipino fishing boat drifted under the stars. Then, out of the shadows, came a larger vessel. In seconds, the small wooden boat was rammed and torn apart. The fishermen screamed as water rushed in. Within moments, the boat began to sink. 22 Filipino men were left clinging to the wreck in the freezing dark. They had no food, no radio, no rescue. The vessel that struck them did not help. It left them to die. Hours passed. The sea grew colder. Hope faded. And then, on the horizon, another light appeared. Not Chinese, not Filipino. It was a Vietnamese vessel. The crew pulled the exhausted men from the waves. That night, Filipino lives were saved by Vietnamese sailors, not by their so-called partner. When the story broke, it spread like fire. Images of abandoned fishermen filled television screens. On social media, anger exploded. This was not just an accident, it was a symbol of betrayal. For the fishermen, it was more than losing a boat. It was losing their livelihood, their safety, their faith in the sea. For the nation, it was a brutal reminder that power politics crush ordinary people first. The message was clear. Beijing might offer loans and projects, but when lives were at stake, it turned away. Could Manila still call China a friend after Reed Bank? Could it ignore the men left drifting in the night? Or would the Philippines turn back to its old allies, to those who might not always promise riches, but had stood beside it when the sea grew dangerous? By 2021, the tide began to shift. The Philippines made a decision that would echo across the region. The Visiting Forces Agreement, once suspended, was restored. Suddenly, American soldiers could once again train, rotate, and deploy from Philippine soil. And soon, another step followed. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement expanded. From 5 sites, the number grew to 9 bases. And these were not random choices. They were positioned with purpose, near the West Philippine Sea and close to Taiwan. For the first time in years, U.S. troops were back in strength, not as an occupying force, but as a shield. For many Filipinos, it felt like protection had returned, a reminder of the old alliance forged in war and tested through decades. Planes roared overhead, ships docked once more, and a quiet message spread across the islands. The Philippines was not alone, but every step brought new pressure. In Beijing, warnings grew louder. Chinese ships pressed harder at sea. Lasers flashed. Water cannons fired. The battle of nerves continued. But this time it was different. When Philippine patrols sailed, they sailed knowing America was close. When Chinese vessels blocked, they blocked under the watch of a global power. The conflict was no longer just Manila versus Beijing. It was Beijing against Washington's presence, and every move raised the stakes higher. For the Philippines, the return of America was not only strategy, it was emotion, it was memory, it was trust renewed after years of doubt. Yet the story did not end there, because soon, the Philippines would find new partners, not just America, but others ready to join the fight. By 2024, the circle around the Philippines grew tighter. It was no longer just America standing guard. Japan stepped forward with new patrols. Its ships sailed beside Philippine vessels in the contested waters. Radars were promised. Defense deals were signed. At the same time, Australia moved in. Joint exercises expanded. Troop pacts were inked. And Filipino soldiers trained shoulder to shoulder with Australian forces on their own soil. The message was unmistakable. The Philippines was weaving itself into a new alliance web. And then came the summit that changed everything. They declared their defense ties ironclad. It was not just a handshake, it was a promise. For Filipinos, the shift was emotional. For years, they had felt alone. Now they could see allies sailing right beside them. The sight of Japanese destroyers, the roar of Australian jets, the presence of American ships, all became proof that Manila was no longer standing in the storm by itself. Meanwhile, China pushed harder. Lasers were fired at patrol boats. Water cannons battered fishing vessels, but each act of coercion backfired. Every push from Beijing only drove Manila deeper into the arms of its allies. By the time the year closed, one truth was clear. The alliances had hardened. And by 2025, the verdict was sealed. By 2025, the break was complete. It was no longer an experiment. It was the new reality. At the same time, Manila drew a clear line in law. Congress codified the country's maritime zones, declaring to the world what was Philippine territory. There would be no more gray areas, no more doubt. And then came the numbers that told the final story. Surveys revealed soaring trust in the U.S. They showed record low trust in China. The public opinion was locked. And once the people had spoken, future leaders could not turn back even if they tried. For soldiers, for ordinary families, the choice was clear. China's dream of pulling Manila back into its orbit had slipped away. In its place stood an alliance wall, iron, unshakable, permanent. The Philippines had crossed the line. It was the point of no return. But behind this final break lay a deeper mystery. What secret had China missed from the very start? China did not lose the Philippines in one battle. It lost it over 3 decades. Every laser fired, every collision at sea, every railway that never came. What it thought was fear became resistance. The truth was simple. Soft power without trust is nothing, and force without legitimacy is defeat. By 2025, the game was already over. The Philippines was no longer a prize to be won. The alliances were permanent. The choice was sealed. From Mischief Reef in 1995 to the joint patrols of 2025, the path was written. China had planted the seeds of its own greatest defeat, and the harvest was bitter. The Philippines had slipped away, not by accident, but by consequence. So the question lingers, sharp and heavy. Could China have kept the Philippines if only it had chosen respect over coercion? Instead, every step only pushed it further away. The Philippines now stands as proof that even small nations can defy giants. When law, allies, and people move as one, Subscribe for more hidden geopolitical stories that reveal how nations win and lose without firing a shot. Do you think China can still turn the tide, or has the Philippines slipped away for good?